America's deadliest battle is the World War I Meuse-Argonne offensive. In 47 days of hard fighting, more than 26,000 American soldiers were killed. The carnage was greater than the bloodiest battles of the Civil War and any battle fought by America during World War II. The battle produced heroes such as Medal of Honor winner Alvin C. York and the legend of the Lost Battalion. It also advanced the careers of Douglas MacArthur and George Patton. Now, some 100 years later, the soldiers are gone and few relics remain to bear witness. One surviving artifact is the tank, Five of Hearts. This photograph of Five of Hearts was taken during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The caption states that the tank was put out of commission on 4 October 1918. The photographer noted that the interior was splattered with blood, that there were nearly 100 holes in the armor, and that the fate of the crew was unknown. The soldiers are preparing to put the tank back in action, but the war will soon end and Five of Hearts will be shipped back to the United States as a memorial to the United States Tank Corps. Join us as we take a closer look at Five of Hearts and its fascinating story. I'm Mark Romanich. With me to talk about Five of Hearts is armored warfare historian and author Steve Zaloga. Steve, thanks for coming out to the Fort Meade Museum.
Nice to be here.
Behind us is the Five of Hearts. It's a French-built Renault FT. Many say it is the first modern tank. To look at it today, it doesn't really look very modern to our eyes, but what made it innovative in its time?
Well, the Renault FT pioneered the classic modern tank configuration. And by that I mean it has the driver up in the front, it's got a turret, and the turret's located in the center, and it has the engine at the rear.
If this tank was so modern, and of course it's French-built, how does it the American forces came to use it?
When the United States entered the First World War in 1917, the U.S. Army had, by that stage, not started to manufacture tanks. So they turned to the Allies. They turned to the French and to the British. And in the French case, they saw the Renault FT. It, at the time, was the best, the most modern French tank. And so the French agreed to provide 2 battalions worth of these tanks.
So the U.S. Army has about 200 of these tanks, and they organized them into 2 battalions. And what was the purpose of the tank?
The FT was basically used to attack enemy machine gun nests. The FT could advance in front of the walking infantry, and if a German machine gun nest popped up, it could destroy the machine gun nest. And in that fashion, the infantry could advance. And so the tank in World War I was considered an infantry support weapon. The main means of attack was still the infantry, but the tank was necessary to overcome the defensive tools of war, the machine gun and the field gun.
So why was it referred to as the Five of Hearts and not by some other designation?
Well, one problem that occurs in tank warfare is how you distinguish the various tanks within a unit. And the practice of using playing card symbols, which is what we see in place here, was actually a French practice. And so what they were doing is that they were identifying the company by the symbol in the back. In the case here, it's C Company, and it has a diamond shape. And then the platoon was identified by the smaller symbol, in this case the heart. And then the number identified the tank within the platoon. So in the case of Five of Hearts, the 5 indicated the 5th tank of the platoon. There were 5 tanks in the platoon. We really don't know how the tank crews referred to their tanks. And one of the reasons is that the casualty rates in these units was ferocious. Five of Hearts, the day that it saw its most famous action on the 4th of October, 1 of every 2 men in that battle, the tankers in that particular battalion, 1 of 2 was wounded in that battle. And that was just one battle in a long, long campaign.
Let's get into the action of October 4th, which is the famous story behind the Five of Hearts.
On that day, they started out with 3 tanks. 1 of them broke down, and then 2 moved forward. So we had the 5th of Hearts being commanded by the platoon commander, 2nd Lieutenant Wood, and then 1 of the sergeants. He was driving in another tank, and that was Sergeant Snyder. So at the beginning of the day, around dawn of the 4th of October, both tanks start out moving in front of the infantry, hoping to overcome the German defenses. And when they look out ahead of them, what they see is a small woods. And not surprisingly, the Germans have set up their defensive positions inside the woods, including machine gun nests and cannon.
There's 2 tanks go forward. One is crewed by Sergeant Snyder. We don't know which tank of the platoon it is. It's either 1 through 4 of Hearts. And Lieutenant Wood, with his driver, Corporal Rogers, is in the 5 of Hearts. And they step off after the initial artillery barrage, and then hell breaks loose for them.
Yes. Now, what machine gun fire does to a tank like this is it can't actually penetrate the tank armor. Even when they're using the anti-armor round, it doesn't have enough energy to penetrate the armor. But what it does do when it hits the armor is that when it impacts, it causes what's called spall. And what that is that when it hits the metal on the other side, some of the hard steel flakes off. So the tankers sitting inside here are getting hit by little flakes of steel. Now, when they have on their regular uniform, that protects them against a certain amount of this spall. But what typically happened in these battles is the spall would hit them in the face. And so a very common injury for these early tank crews was temporary blindness. And what happens on the 4th of October with Lieutenant Wood, the commander of the original commander of this tank, is that fairly early on in the battle, he's blinded by this spall, this metal flaking. So what ends up happening is that the driver backs up the tank back towards the start line in order to allow Lieutenant Wood to get out. At almost the same time, Sergeant Snyder's tank is also advancing in the same direction. His tank is hit by a field gun. Now, a field gun, a direct hit in a tank like this, if it hit the body of the tank, could kill the crew. In the case of Snyder's tank, he was somewhat lucky. The field gun did not hit the crew. It hit the suspension, the tracks of the tank. It basically severed the track. So the tank isn't going anywhere. It stopped the tank dead in its track. The crew realized it couldn't do anything, so they escaped from the tank. They had to literally crawl back to the start line because there's all this fire going on. There's machine gun fire and rifle fire, artillery fire. So they crawl back, and when they get back to the start line, they find that Lieutenant Wood's tank has been brought back because of Lieutenant Wood's injury. And Lieutenant Wood tells Snyder to take over. Once Snyder took over command of the 5 of Hearts, they went back into the battle. And so they advance again towards the woods and come under a hail of gunfire. And the same thing happens to the driver, to the first driver, as had happened earlier to Lieutenant Wood. That is, he starts getting struck in the driver's position by a large amount of machine gun fire and other fire that basically starts striking him in the face, and eventually he gets wounded to the point where he can't continue the battle. And so we have a situation here where Sergeant Snyder can still operate the tank weapons, but he has a driver who no longer can function as the driver. So it's necessary first to remove the driver and bring him to safety. So they do so. Snyder helps the driver out, and the driver is sent back behind the lines to get medical attention. He's got to find a driver. Where do you find a tank driver in the middle of a battle? And so just luckily, he sees somebody who has the tank corps insignia on in the rear area, and he says, "Do you know how to drive a tank?" Soldier says, "Yes, I know how to drive a tank." So he's immediately recruited to drive the tank. And so this other young soldier gets into the driver's position, and they move forward again. So this tank already has had 2 separate drivers and 2 separate commanders during the course of this particular battle. And so they move forward, and the tank gets deep into the German lines and is literally being assaulted on all sides. If you take a look at the tank, you'll see that there's damage not only in the front, not only on the side, there's a significant amount of damage from the rear. So they were right in the German positions. And they get to the stage where the tank eventually is broken down and where the weapons no longer function entirely well. I mean, it may seem surprising, but the turret area was actually struck by so many bullets that bullets actually jammed the turret. The lead of the bullets got down into the gap between the turret and the hull, jammed the turret, prevented the turret from being moved back and forth. The gun manlet, the part of the gun that allows the gun to go up and down, it got struck, that little gap got struck so many times by the bullets that Sergeant Snyder couldn't elevate the gun. And so they remained there, and for the later part of the battle, later in the day, Sergeant Snyder is actually defending the tank by opening up the little port on the side there and taking his .45 caliber pistol and defending the tank against the German infantry by sticking his pistol out and blasting away at the German infantry with his pistol, because his main gun, his 37 millimeter gun, he can't aim it. It's stuck in place. So it was a very desperate battle. And then finally, the infantry gets up to the tank and finally pushes the Germans away. But by the end of the day, it has hundreds of bullet hits on it. It's got damage inside from the spall that came in. It's had most of its crews injured to one extent or the other.
So on 4 October, the tank was crewed by 4 different crew members, of which 3 were wounded. Lieutenant Wood gets spalling or splinters to the eyes. Corporal Rogers, who's driving the tank, suffers the same fate. Sergeant Snyder, when the tank failed and was turned into a pillbox and he had to fight off the Germans, he gets shrapnel to the back of his head from all the machine gun fire hitting the top of the cupola. And then his driver that he had picked up earlier in the day receives such severe wounds that he dies on 5 October, after the battle anyway. For 99 years, we've not known the name of the 4th soldier, and Arthur Snyder would say that maybe that soldier, the unknown driver, had the greatest honor in that he did his duty and we didn't know who he was and that he selflessly died. And through a process of elimination, knowing that this driver that Arthur Snyder just grabbed up off the battlefield came from the 345th Battalion, the sister battalion, and looking at who was wounded and when they died, it is very likely that we now know, 99 years later, that Snyder's driver was George Coates, Corporal George Coates from Pennsylvania, and that he died the next day on 5 October, and he was buried in the Meuse-Argonne Cemetery, and that's where he remains to this day. What we're looking at here when we look at the 5 of Hearts is we're looking at a memorial tank because it was brought back by the unit because they saw it as significant, but it's also a memorial tank that was crewed by 4 heroes that day. Talking to you, I realize that there's far more to this than just what he said. You're a fountain of knowledge, and I have to say I've learned a lot. Thank you very much for coming out here and putting a little more depth to the story behind the 5 of Hearts.
Happy to do so.
5 of Hearts, a survivor of America's deadliest battle and a lasting memorial to its crewmen, Lieutenant Wood, Corporal Rogers, Sergeant Snyder, and Corporal Coates. Thank you to Steve Zaloga for his expert commentary. Steve is the author of numerous books on armored warfare. To learn more about World War I tanks, consider these books written by him.